A 12-year-old boy stumbles upon a watch lying on the pavement, its elegant design catching the last light of the setting sun. Selling it could change his world and lift his family out of their struggles forever. What he doesn't realize, however, is that this timepiece belongs to none other than one of Hollywood's most cherished actors, Keanu Reeves. What unfolds next will ignite a chain of events more extraordinary than he could have ever imagined. Before we dive deeper into this gripping tale, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if you love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow, another thrilling adventure awaits. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting golden streaks across the towering buildings of Los Angeles. Its light pooled on the sidewalks, elongating the shadows of street lamps and pedestrians. Keanu Reeves walked at an unhurried pace, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, his gaze distant. Though the city's hum pulsed around him, this quieter street seemed untouched by time, as if existing in its own realm. A neon sign blinked softly above an old cafe, alternating between warm blue and deep red, its glow reflecting on the wet asphalt. Keanu pushed open the glass door, and a small bell chimed. Inside, the wooden walls, round tables, and soft jazz playing from an old radio wrapped the space in nostalgia. He made his way to his usual corner and sank into the chair, the weight of unspoken thoughts settling on his shoulders. A waitress approached, a cloth draped over her shoulder. "The usual?" she asked with a knowing smile. He nodded, offering a small smile in return. Moments later, a steaming cup of coffee sat before him. He wrapped his fingers around the warmth, but before bringing it to his lips, his fingers instinctively brushed against the worn leather strap of his watch. The metal was scratched, the edges softened with time. Yet the dial still gleamed, a testament to its legacy. He tightened the strap. A subconscious habit, before shifting his gaze to the window. His reflection stared back, his thoughts clouded with distant memories. Taking a deep breath, he finally sipped the coffee, savoring its rich bitterness. After a few minutes, he placed a few bills on the table, stood up, and walked toward the door. The bell chimed again as he stepped into the crisp evening air. The lingering warmth of the day was fading, replaced by the cool touch of twilight. He strolled down the sidewalk, lost in thought, completely unaware that the clasp of his watch had loosened. With a slightly longer stride, the strap slipped from his wrist. The watch landed soundlessly on the pavement. Without a backward glance, Keanu continued walking, oblivious to what he had just left behind. On the other side of the city, the sky deepened into a velvety blue, the last streaks of sunlight fading beyond the horizon. In a modest, cluttered workshop, the air was thick with the scent of oil and metal. Daniel wiped his hands on an old rag, his small frame silhouetted against the dim glow of a hanging bulb. At just 12 years old, he was shorter than most boys his age, but what he lacked in height, he made up for in quick wit and sharp instincts. His father closed the toolbox with a tired sigh, rubbing his calloused hands. "Lock up when you're done, okay?" he said, his voice weary from a long day's labor. Daniel nodded. His father disappeared into the house, leaving the boy alone with the scattered spare parts, gears, and half-assembled engines. He loved this world, one where he could take things apart and piece them back together, understanding how they worked. But despite his fascination, he had never truly owned anything of his own. Stepping outside, he straddled his bicycle and pushed off, his legs pumping against the creaking pedals. The streets were slowly emptying, the flickering glow of streetlights casting long, wavering shadows across the asphalt. That's when he saw it. A small glimmer by the curb, a faint metallic flash under the dim light. Curiosity piqued, he skidded to a stop, his tires scraping against the pavement. He crouched down, his fingers brushing against the cool surface of a watch. But this wasn't just any watch. Lifting it carefully, he felt its weight in his palm. The worn leather strap, the gleaming stainless steel case. It was unlike anything he had ever held before. He turned it over, his heart beginning to pound. He had seen this model before. It couldn't be, could it? With trembling hands, he unzipped his backpack and pulled out his most treasured possession. An old magazine featuring the world's most iconic timepieces. The pages were dog-eared, some with pencil marks circling his favorite models. Frantically, he flipped through until his breath hitched. There it was, Rolex Daytona Paul Newman, a legend among collectors, renowned for its rarity and historic significance. His fingers traced the details, the white dial, black subdials, the striking red lettering above the 6 o'clock mark. His eyes flickered between the glossy magazine photo and the watch in his hand. It was an exact match. A wave of disbelief washed over him. The Paul Newman Daytona had been auctioned for millions before. Owning something like this was unfathomable. But then, his gaze fell upon the back of the watch, and his breath caught in his throat. An engraving. For Keanu, my love. Never forget who you are. His stomach twisted into knots. Keanu. The name was familiar, uncommon, but recognizable. He ran his thumb over the inscription, as if hoping it would reveal the story it carried. Whoever lost this watch wasn't just anyone, and right now, that person was likely searching desperately for it. Daniel stood there, gripping the watch tightly. The street was silent. There was no sign of its owner. His mind whirled. He knew exactly what he held in his hands, and now, he had a decision to make. As he rode slowly through the dimly lit streets, the watch nestled in his palm. He felt its weight in more ways than one. This wasn't just a lost item. It was an opportunity. Selling it could change everything. The thought consumed him. His father's workshop could finally thrive, no longer surviving on underpaid repair jobs. His mother wouldn't have to carefully count coins at the market, choosing between milk or bread. They could move into a bigger house, or new clothes, never have to worry about money again. Never again would he have to see the exhaustion in his parents' eyes. He turned the watch over again, studying its craftsmanship, the smooth curve of the glass, the perfectly balanced dials. It wasn't just expensive, it was a golden ticket to a new life. And it was right there, in his hands. On impulse, he fastened the strap around his wrist. The fit was perfect. He imagined walking into his father's workshop, revealing the fortune they would soon have. The joy, the relief, the chance to start anew. His pulse quickened. Then, he felt the clasp press against his skin, and a voice echoed in his mind. What isn't yours doesn't belong to you. His father's words, firm, unwavering. Daniel swallowed hard. His eyes drifted back to the engraving. For Keanu, my love. His chest tightened. This watch wasn't just valuable, it carried meaning. Someone out there cared deeply about it. And somehow, Daniel knew that person needed it back. He squeezed his eyes shut. The dilemma clawed at him. The promise of freedom from financial struggles versus the weight of doing what was right. What should he do? The choice would change everything. He took a deep breath and yanked the watch off his wrist as if it seared his skin. Daniel gripped the timepiece between his fingers, trying to comprehend the weight of his choice. Then, something subtle caught his eye on the inside of a leather strap. He frowned, tilting the watch under the dim streetlight. Etched in minuscule, almost imperceptible font was a phone number, an area code he didn't recognize. His heart pounded. If someone had gone through the trouble of engraving it there, this watch was more than just valuable. With slightly trembling hands, he pulled his phone from his pocket and carefully entered the numbers, one by one. His thumb hovered over the call button. Should he? He swallowed hard, took a steadying breath, and pressed call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Daniel felt a knot tighten in his throat. Then, the call connected. This is Rachel. Who's calling? The female voice was firm and alert. The watch suddenly felt heavier in his palm. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What had he just done? The phone continued to ring in his mind as the silence on the other end stretched. But Rachel spoke again, her voice unwavering. Hello. Daniel clenched his jaw and forced himself to respond. I found a watch. A second of silence passed, but it felt infinitely longer. What kind of watch? Her voice sharpened with interest. Daniel glanced at the object in his grasp. A Rolex Daytona Paul Newman, leather strap, white dial with black subdials. There's an engraving on the back. Rachel went quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted, tinged with something deeper. What does it say? He ran his fingers over the cool metal and read aloud. For Keanu, my love. Never forget who you are. On the other end of the line, Rachel let out a short breath. Not just relief but something heavier, as if a puzzle piece had just clicked into place. Where did you find it? Near a cafe. It was just lying there, in the middle of the street. Rachel was silent for a few moments, as though organizing her thoughts. When she spoke again, her voice was more personal, more direct. Daniel, that watch belongs to Keanu Reeves. He realized he lost it, and has been extremely worried. A shiver ran down Daniel's spine. The name suddenly made sense. He had, of course, heard of Keanu Reeves, the movies, the interviews, but never in his wildest dreams did he imagine he'd be holding something that belonged to him. Rachel continued, her tone reassuring now. I've been his personal assistant for years. When he noticed the watch was missing, we retraced his steps, searched the cafe, the entire street, but it was gone. Daniel looked at the Rolex again. The way she spoke made it clear. The watch was more than an accessory. It meant something. The silence stretched again. Finally, he took a deep breath and asked, how do I know you're telling the truth? Rachel let out a small chuckle, not in offense, but as if she respected the caution. You're smart. That's good. There was faint movement in the background. Listen, Keanu Reeves wants to meet you in person to thank you. He asked me to speak to you first to make sure everything is handled properly. Daniel frowned. He wants to see me. Yes, Rachel confirmed, but only if you're comfortable with it. His heart pounded. He never imagined a lost watch would lead him here. Where? Rachel's voice softened slightly. There's a diner on Main Street that stays open late. Can we meet there? Daniel took a deep breath, glanced around as if searching for an answer in the night. Then, he gave a small nod to himself. Okay. Rachel paused for a moment before responding, her voice genuine. Thank you, Daniel. Truly. He didn't answer, just ended the call. For a long moment, he stood still, absorbing the weight of what had just happened. Then, he carefully placed the watch in his backpack, hopped onto his bike, and paddled toward what he knew would be a life-changing meeting. Did you bring it? Daniel glanced around before nodding. Yes. Rachel noticed the hesitation in his eyes. It's okay. Keanu's already inside. He just wants to thank you. Through the diner window, Daniel saw him. Keanu Reeves, sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee in front of him. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't in a hurry. He was just waiting. Daniel's pulse quickened. Rachel nudged him gently. He's a good guy. Come on. Daniel inhaled deeply and stepped inside. The doorbell chimed as he entered. Keanu looked up and smiled. It wasn't polite or distant. It was warm, genuine. Rachel walked up to the table first. Here he is. Keanu nodded, his gaze now fully on Daniel. So, you found a watch? His voice was calm. Daniel nodded in response. He swung his backpack off his shoulder, unzipped it carefully, and pulled out the Rolex. He placed it on the table. Keanu didn't grab it immediately. He just stared at it for a moment, fingers tracing its outline, as if reconnecting with something precious. Then, he turned it over, reading the engraving. He inhaled deeply, and for the first time, Daniel felt the real weight of what this watch meant. Then, Keanu smiled. I thought I'd never see this again. Daniel swallowed. I just found it on the street. Keanu finally picked up the watch and fastened it around his wrist. The fit was perfect. He looked at Daniel. Thank you. This time, his eyes carried more than just gratitude. Keanu reached for an envelope on the table and held it out. I want you to have this. Daniel hesitated before taking it. When he opened it, his breath caught. Inside was money. A lot of money. More than he had ever seen. His hands tightened around the envelope. This is a lot. Keanu smiled knowingly. I know. Daniel felt his chest constrict. This money could change his family's life. But something inside him made him hesitate. He glanced at Rachel, then at Keanu. I don't know if I can accept this. Keanu rested his elbows on the table, fingers intertwined. Why not? Daniel's mind whirled. Of course he wanted it. Of course he needed it. But something about simply taking the money and walking away didn't sit right with him. He took a breath and spoke the only truth he could muster. I didn't do this for money. Keanu was silent for a long moment. Then, he smiled again. Just slightly, as if he already knew. I know. And in that moment, Daniel realized this was just the beginning. He clutched the envelope, feeling its weight, knowing it wasn't just cash inside. It was a decision, a crossroad. He looked up at Keanu, who simply watched him, calm, patient, as if he already knew exactly what was running through Daniel's mind. This could pay all my family's bills, Daniel murmured to himself. It could, Keanu agreed. But I don't want you to take it just because you need it. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? Keanu took a slow sip of coffee before setting his cup down. You thought about selling the watch, didn't you? A chill ran down Daniel's spine. The air in the diner suddenly grew heavier. Daniel wanted to deny it, but the truth weighed on him. Lowering his gaze to the envelope, he answered quietly, yes. Keanu didn't seem surprised. He simply nodded, as if that was the answer he had expected all along. And why didn't you? Daniel blinked a few times. The reason should have been obvious. He had done the right thing. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the real reason. Taking a deep breath, he admitted, because I knew someone would miss it. A small smile crossed Keanu's face. That's rare. Daniel looked at the envelope again. A part of him wanted to accept it, needed to accept it, but another part resisted, whispering that this wasn't right. He bit his lip. I don't know if I can take this. Keanu leaned forward slightly. Then don't. Daniel frowned. But you want me to have it. Keanu gave him a knowing smile but said nothing. Less than 10 minutes later, a car pulled up outside the diner. A man in a suit stepped inside, greeted Keanu, and handed him a different envelope. Without hesitation, Keanu opened it and slid a document across the table toward Daniel. If you want, you can start tomorrow. Daniel hesitated, then carefully picked up the paper. His eyes widened as he read the words. Internship at the Los Angeles Institute of Engineering and Watchmaking. Training for young talents. Scholarship for the future. His heart pounded. He looked up at Keanu, incredulous. This is real? Keanu chuckled. You reminded me of something important today, that good deeds should be rewarded, but not with money, with opportunity. Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat. He never imagined that finding a watch on the street would lead to this moment. A chance to change everything. Keanu must have noticed the emotions playing across his face because he leaned in and said, This isn't charity, Daniel. It's an investment. Daniel clutched the paper in his hands. For the first time, he felt something greater than money, a future. Keanu smiled. So, what do you say? The next morning, Daniel woke up to an unusual sound. The steady hum of a strong engine outside his window. Still groggy, he got out of bed and peeked outside. A sleek black SUV was parked in front of his house. His father, still in his pajamas, stood at the door, scratching his head as he eyed the vehicle. Daniel's stomach twisted. This was really happening. Before he could come up with an excuse, the driver stepped out of the car and approached the house. Good morning. Is Daniel here? His father turned to look at him, one eyebrow raised. Kid, is there something you need to tell me? Daniel swallowed hard. He hadn't told his father anything yet. The driver opened the car door and gave him an expectant look. Are you ready? Taking a deep breath, Daniel looked at his father, then at the car. This wasn't a dream. He nodded. Yes. The ride was silent at first. Daniel gazed out the window, watching the city blur past. He still didn't know exactly what to expect. The driver took unfamiliar roads, leading him to a part of the city he had never seen before. Towering buildings, sleek, futuristic architecture, a world that felt completely separate from his own. When the car finally stopped, Daniel spotted Keanu, waiting outside the entrance of a glass panel building. He stepped out of the vehicle, trying to absorb everything around him. Keanu smiled. Welcome to the future. Daniel turned his gaze to the building behind him. Above the entrance, a large sign read, Los Angeles Institute of Engineering and Watchmaking. His heart pounded. What is this place? Keanu tucked his hands into his pockets. A lab where some of the brightest minds refine the art of watchmaking. He pushed open the glass door and motioned for Daniel to follow. "If you want, you can start today." Daniel stepped inside, his eyes widening as he took in the space. Glass-walled rooms lined the hallways. Workbenches were filled with tiny, intricate tools. Engineers peered through magnifying glasses, working on parts so small they seemed invisible to the naked eye. He was mesmerized. Keanu led him to a workstation where a technician was carefully adjusting the inner mechanics of a watch. Every movement was precise, calculated, almost hypnotic. "You like taking things apart," Keanu said, watching Daniel's reaction. "But have you ever thought about creating?" Daniel didn't answer, because at that moment, he realized he had. This was a world he wanted to explore. Keanu must have seen the light in his eyes because he smiled. "If you want, you can start learning today." Daniel looked down at his own hands. He had always fixed old, broken things. But now, he had the chance to build something that would last. His eyes lit up. "I want to." Keanu nodded, satisfied. "Then let's begin." Daniel never again had to wonder, what if I had taken the money instead? The answer was all around him. In his father's thriving workshop, in the peace that had settled over his home, in the passion he had discovered in himself. That night, as he looked around at the people he had once thought were worlds apart from him, he realized something. A single act of honesty had changed everything. And sometimes, the right choice isn't about what you give up, it's about what you gain. If you found a lost watch, what would you do? If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, compassion, and resilience.
In case you did not watch Keanu Inspirational Last Story, I will leave you with it now. Wish you enjoy it.
Keanu Reeves was navigating the streets of Los Angeles when something compelled him to hit the brakes. A solitary figure was seated on the sidewalk, enveloped in a worn-out blanket. Initially, it seemed like just another lost soul in the city. But then his heart skipped a beat. He recognized that face. What followed would not only alter his night, but also reveal a painful past he could never overlook. Before we proceed with this tale, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The deep rumble of the Norton Commando 961 pierced the quiet Los Angeles night, resonating through the deserted streets. The city was asleep, its lights flickering softly as the early morning fog began to spread across the asphalt. Keanu Reeves rode his motorcycle with a distant expression, his leather gloves gripping the handlebars tightly, the cold wind brushing against his face. He cherished these hours after long charity events, speeches, and interviews. The bike was his escape. The sound of the engine, the scent of asphalt, the freedom of the road. It allowed him to forget, if only briefly, the burden of fame and expectations. That night's event had been significant. The fundraiser had secured funding for an arts education program in public schools, a cause dear to him. As he shook hands and posed for photos, his mind wandered back to his early days in theater, that insecure kid on stage, trying to find his voice. In that stream of thought, something made him blink and ease the brakes. To his right, a figure was curled up on the sidewalk, leaning against the worn-out wall of a closed commercial building. A woman, just another homeless person on the streets of Los Angeles. A common sight that, no matter how painful, had become part of the city's landscape. But then a chill ran down his spine. He couldn't quite identify what made him slow down. Perhaps it was the way she sat, a posture too still, too withdrawn. Maybe it was the way her frail body clung to the dirty, tattered blanket. Perhaps it was just instinct, or maybe it was something else. He frowned, quickly looking forward again, his heart beginning to race, a quiet unease spreading through his chest. The bike moved forward a few more meters before he decided to stop. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment. This doesn't make sense, he thought. But what was stopping him from checking, just to be sure, just to clear the doubt in his mind? With a smooth motion, he turned the bike around, slowing down as he approached the spot where he had seen the woman. His headlight cast a dim glow over her frail frame, a small, fragile silhouette against the cold concrete. He pulled over at the curb and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was piercing. Keanu slowly removed his gloves, his fingers trembling for no apparent reason. Something deep inside him already knew the answer before he even asked the question. He stepped forward, his boots echoing on the damp pavement. The woman shifted slightly, perhaps sensing his presence. His heart pounded against his ribs as he got closer, taking in the details. The worn-out coat, the gray, tangled strands of hair escaping from beneath the hood, the thin, wrinkled hands clutching the filthy blanket as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to this world. And then his stomach twisted. Even in the dim light, even with the shadows masking the toll of time and hardship, that face was etched into his memory. Time seemed to freeze. Keanu wetted his lips, his throat tightening. When he spoke, his voice was hesitant, almost a whisper. "Mrs. Collins." The woman shuddered at the sound of his voice. Slowly, as if each movement required tremendous effort, she lifted her face toward him, her dull, weary eyes meeting his. Keanu held his breath for a moment, a heavy silence blanketing the air as if time itself had paused between recognition and disbelief. She blinked slowly, her gaze struggling to focus, her expression flickering from confusion to something else. The world around them disappeared. No more empty streets, no more cold night air. Just this moment suspended between the past and the harsh reality of now. Her lips parted, and then her knees buckled, her body pitching forward. Keanu lunged instinctively, his arms moving fast to catch her before she hit the ground. A chill ran down his spine. She was too light, too fragile. His mind raced with questions, but this wasn't the time for answers, because before he could say anything else, her eyes fluttered closed, and in that instant, Keanu knew nothing about this night would end the way it began. Time seemed to slow as Keanu held Mrs. Collins' frail body before she could hit the ground. His heart pounded against his ribs. "Mrs. Collins," he called again, but there was no response. She was conscious but seemed unable to hold herself up, her breathing uneven, her thin shoulders trembling, whether from the cold or exhaustion, he couldn't tell. Keanu glanced around. The streets were empty, only a few distant cars passing by. The faint wail of a siren echoed through the city, blending with the soft hum of the streetlights. He didn't know what to do. Instinctively, he helped her sit up properly, propping her against the wall. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open slowly, unfocused. He noticed the dark circles beneath them, the way her skin was etched with time and suffering. Then she whispered something. "Keanu." His name came out in a breath of disbelief, as if she were trying to confirm whether he was real or just another figment of a fading memory. Keanu nodded, trying to offer a reassuring smile. His chest felt constricted. "It's me, Mrs. Collins. It's really me." The silence between them was intense. He could see her mind working, trying to understand why he was there, standing before her after so many years. As the initial shock began to fade, a deeper emotion flickered in her eyes. Recognition. For a brief moment, Keanu was no longer in the chilly streets of Los Angeles. He was a boy again, standing nervously on a small school stage, clutching a script with sweaty hands. Her voice echoed in his mind. "On stage, you never hide. You feel. You live." Then he was back in the present, looking at the woman who had taught him everything about acting. But now she seemed unrecognizable. Keanu's chest tightened. How had this happened? He swallowed hard and finally broke the silence. "Is it really you?" She took a shaky breath, her voice raspy. "I think so." Her words were fragile, as if they carried the weight of years. Keanu hesitated. There were so many things he wanted to ask, but something told him to tread carefully. "You," he started, but stopped. What could he possibly say? Mrs. Collins tried to shift, but her body wouldn't cooperate. She shivered, and Keanu realized just how weak she was. Without thinking, he took off his leather jacket and draped it over her shoulders. She flinched at the sudden warmth, but didn't resist. Then, in a barely audible voice, she said, "It's been a long time, hasn't it?" Keanu nodded, watching her closely. Yes, it had been a long time. But no number of years could have prepared him to find her like this. She ran a hand over her face as if trying to wake herself from a nightmare, her gaze dropping to the ground. Keanu noticed her hesitation, the shame of not wanting to be seen like this. But he saw her, and before he could stop himself, the question slipped from his lips. "What happened to you?" The silence that followed was sharp, cutting through the night like a blade. Mrs. Collins lowered her head, her thin hands clutching the filthy blanket tighter against her chest. Keanu could feel the weight of the moment. Her story was there, hidden between the words she couldn't say. He waited, and finally, after a long pause, she whispered something that sent a cold wave through him. "I tried, Keanu." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she looked at him again. "I tried." What did she mean by that? What had she tried? Before Keanu could ask, her body gave out once more. She collapsed forward, and Keanu caught her firmly. This time, he knew he couldn't leave her there. He had to do something. With his mind racing and his heart pounding, Keanu made his decision. But he knew this night was far from over. The silence between them was heavy. Keanu still held Mrs. Collins, making sure she wouldn't collapse again. The weight of her body in his arms felt unreal, like she was only a shadow of the woman he had known years ago. Slowly, he helped her lean back against the cold wall of the building. Her breathing was unsteady, broken by small shivers. He didn't know if it was from the cold night air or sheer exhaustion pulling her down. He hesitated before speaking. "Can you hear me?" She blinked slowly, as if keeping her eyes open was a battle. After a few moments, her gaze found his. "I can." Keanu let out a quiet breath. The truth was, he had no idea what to do. The urgency to help her was overwhelming, but at the same time, he knew he couldn't just pick her up and drag her to a better place. He needed to understand, "What happened to you?" Mrs. Collins immediately looked away. The question lingered between them, unanswered. The silence stretched. Keanu sat beside her, ignoring the cold, dirty pavement. She didn't have to answer right now, but he wasn't going anywhere. He would wait. Mrs. Collins clutched the blanket tighter around herself, as if it was the only thing holding her together. Her breathing had steadied, but her gaze remained distant. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice low and rough. "You shouldn't be here." Keanu looked at her calmly. "And you should." She let out a short, humorless laugh. "Nice one, Reeves." He didn't smile. There was something in her eyes, something beyond pain. Shame. She didn't want to be seen like this, but he had already seen her. Mrs. Collins took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to keep going. "The truth is, I don't know what to say. I didn't want anyone to see me like this, least of all you." Keanu remained silent. He knew that sometimes silence was more powerful than any words. She hesitated, her eyes locked on the empty street. Then finally, she began to speak. "I lost my job when the theater program was cut." Keanu had suspected something like that might happen, but hearing it from her made it real. "I tried to keep going, offering private lessons for a while, and taking on small jobs here and there, but everything started to unravel. The bills piled up, and the city consumed me entirely." She paused, her gaze drifting into memories that seemed too painful to relive all at once. "Initially, I thought it was just a rough patch, that I'd find something new and everything would return to normal. But as the months went by, I suddenly found myself without a home." Keanu felt a knot tighten in his throat. He had always known life could be harsh, but he never imagined she had fallen this far. "I spent some time moving from couch to couch, staying with people who still cared, but eventually, doors began to close. People get tired. No one wants a long-term problem in their life." Keanu knew that was true. The world could be unforgiving. Mrs. Collins rubbed her hands together as if trying to shake off a cold that had settled deep inside her. "And then, before I realized it, it was too late." Keanu's chest ached as he thought of everything she had meant to him. All the time she had encouraged him and helped him find his voice on stage. And now she was here, alone and broken. He wanted to say something, but before he could, she murmured almost to herself, "The hardest part isn't losing things. It's losing people." She pressed her lips together as if holding something bigger inside. Then her voice dropped lower, trembling. "I pushed everyone away, Keanu, the few who still cared, because the truth is, I didn't want to be a burden." A chill ran through him. He knew that feeling, the sense that you're dragging people down, that it's better to disappear than to become someone else's problem. He knew that shadow, but seeing it in her hurt in a way he wasn't prepared for. Then she said something that made his heartbeat quicken. "And I made a mistake I can't undo." She didn't explain, but Keanu noticed the hesitation in her voice, the weight behind her words. There was something else, something she wasn't ready to say. "Not yet?" The silence stretched between them. Keanu ran a hand through his hair, trying to think. He wanted to ask the right questions, but he knew he couldn't push, so he simply said firmly, "You're not a burden to me." Mrs. Collins closed her eyes, looking away. "You say that now?" Keanu shook his head. "I say that because it's true." She let out a long breath, like she wanted to believe him but couldn't. And then he asked the question he didn't want to ask but knew he had to. "What about your children?" The air between them shifted. Mrs. Collins's body tensed. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. But then she whispered, barely audible, "They tried to help me for a while." The incomplete answer made Keanu's stomach turn. What happened with her children? Why was she here alone? Before he could ask anything else, Mrs. Collins's gaze drifted back to the empty street. She seemed distant, far from this moment, and for the first time that night, Keanu saw something in her eyes that unsettled him. A silent darkness, a pain too deep to put into words, something beyond physical suffering. And he knew her story was far worse than he had imagined, and he hadn't heard all of it yet. Her words hung in the air like a knife suspended, ready to fall. "They tried to help me for a while." Keanu felt the weight of that sentence. Mrs. Collins's tone wasn't just sad. There was something else beneath it, something he didn't yet understand. The silence between them stretched. She kept staring at the empty street as if she were somewhere else, lost in memories he couldn't reach. Keanu wanted to ask more. He wanted to understand. But something in her expression stopped him. He noticed the way her fingers clenched around the filthy blanket, holding on to it as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded in the present. So he just waited. The sharp night wind swept through the street, carrying the distant sound of a car passing on another avenue. Finally, she sighed. They did what they could. They helped when things started to fall apart. She moved her fingers slowly, lost in thought. But after a while, I pushed them away. Keanu frowned. "Why?" She let out a short, hollow laugh. "Because I didn't want to be a burden." He closed his eyes for a moment. That feeling, he knew it well, but still, it didn't make sense. And they just accepted that? Mrs. Collins hesitated before answering. "Not right away. They tried. They gave me options, but I refused." She bit her lower lip as if holding something bigger inside. After a while, they stopped insisting. Keanu felt a tightness in his chest. He tried to picture what had happened. He imagined her children's faces he had never seen, reaching out to help her, only to watch her pull away. And then all that remained, silence settled over them again. And that's when he noticed something. When the sleeve of her tattered coat slipped slightly, he saw it. A scar, thin and pale, stretching along her forearm. A knot formed in his stomach. She realized he had seen it, but she didn't move to cover it. She just looked at him, and in that look, there was a warning. "Don't ask." Keanu pressed his lips together. He wanted to ask. He wanted to know what it meant. But part of him already knew the answer, and for now, he wasn't sure she was ready to talk about it. So instead, he simply said, his voice steady, "I'm here now." Mrs. Collins let out a short laugh. "And what difference does that make?" Keanu looked directly into her eyes. "It signifies that you're no longer alone." She blinked, as if those words were hard to comprehend. Before she could reply, the silence of the night was interrupted by footsteps. Someone was walking along the sidewalk, not far from them. Keanu instinctively turned his head, and Mrs. Collins did the same. A shadow moved under the dim streetlights. A man in loose, dirty clothes, his weary eyes fixed on them. He stopped a few feet away. "Hey." His voice was rough. "Got a cigarette?" Mrs. Collins shook her head. "I don't smoke." The man glanced at Keanu, who just stared back, relaxed yet vigilant. The man shrugged and continued walking. Mrs. Collins exhaled slowly. "Don't trust anyone around here," she advised, looking at Keanu. "You should go." He raised an eyebrow. And leave you here alone? She chuckled softly. I'm not as fragile as I look. Keanu narrowed his eyes. No, but you're not invincible either. She didn't respond. The wind blew again, lifting dust from the sidewalk. Keanu knew this night was far from over, and that Mrs. Collins had much more to share. The night dragged on, and the city of Los Angeles remained cold and indifferent. Keanu had no idea how long he had been sitting there with Mrs. Collins, maybe minutes, maybe hours. But something inside him told him he couldn't just leave her there. She, on the other hand, seemed convinced otherwise. You should go. Her voice was quiet but firm. Keanu crossed his arms, leaning against the wall beside her. I won't. She let out a tired sigh. Keanu, don't even try to convince me. Her eyes flickered with a mix of exasperation and something else he couldn't quite decipher. Were you always this stubborn? He smirked slightly. I learned from a certain teacher. She lowered her head and let out a short, humorless laugh. The silence between them lingered. Mrs. Collins pulled the blanket tighter around herself, shrinking slightly. Keanu could see how exhausted she was, how the cold in the streets had drained her. But he also saw something deeper. She didn't want help, or rather, she didn't believe she deserved it, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Keanu looked around. The streets were empty, but he knew the city never truly slept. He turned back to her, his voice more serious now. You can't stay here all night. She lifted her eyes to him. And what do you suggest? Keanu hesitated for a moment before answering. Let's go somewhere else. She raised an eyebrow, as if the idea was absurd. And where would we go? He thought quickly. A hotel? No, she would refuse. His house? She would never accept. Then an idea surfaced, a 24-hour cafe. She blinked, caught off guard. What? Keanu shrugged. Nothing fancy, just a warm place. Coffee, food. You can rest for a bit. She opened her mouth to refuse, but Keanu spoke first. Just 1 hour, then you decide what to do. Mrs. Collins pressed her lips together. He could see the battle happening inside her. Accepting meant admitting she needed help, but refusing meant spending the night on that cold piece of concrete. Finally, she sighed. 1 hour. Keanu let out a small smile. Deal. The bell on the cafe door jingled as they stepped inside. The place was simple, with a few scattered customers at worn-out tables. Keanu led Mrs. Collins to a quiet corner. She walked slowly, as if every step took effort. Once they sat down, a waiter approached. What can I get you? Keanu looked at Mrs. Collins, waiting for her to order, but she hesitated. He noticed she wasn't used to choosing, so he did it for her. 2 coffees and whatever's the warmest, most filling thing on the menu. The waiter nodded and walked away. Mrs. Collins looked at him. Have you always had this instinct to save people? Keanu shrugged. I just do what feels right. She sighed, running a hand through her hair, still messy despite being clean. Sometimes people don't want to be saved. Keanu held her gaze for a moment. Sometimes they just think they can't be. Silence settled between them again. When the coffee arrived, Mrs. Collins wrapped both hands around the cup as if absorbing its warmth. She closed her eyes as she took the first sip. Keanu watched her. She looked so small in that moment. So much had been taken from her. But at the same time, he saw something different. A spark, faint but still there. Then suddenly, she broke the silence. You want to ask about the scar, don't you? The question caught Keanu off guard. He looked at her for a moment. He thought about lying, saying no, but he was always a terrible liar. I do. She lowered her eyes to the table. It took a few moments before she spoke. I was at my lowest point, Keanu. Worse than now. He held his breath. She traced the rim of her cup with her fingers. I didn't see a way out. I didn't think it was worth trying. A chill ran down Keanu's spine. She didn't need to say more. He understood. Mrs. Collins took a deep breath. But I'm here, still, somehow. Keanu watched her for a long time, then simply said, I'm glad you are. She lifted her eyes to him, surprised, and for a brief moment, Keanu saw something new in her expression. Something that wasn't there before. Hope. Mrs. Collins looked down at her coffee, lost in thought. Then she murmured, "Why are you doing this, Keanu?" He didn't answer right away. He just held her gaze and mentioned that it was because you did it for me. Initially, silence enveloped them, but this time it was a different kind of quiet, a silence brimming with potential. The first step had been taken, yet the journey ahead remained lengthy. Mrs. Collins held the warm coffee in her hands, not drinking it, as if the warmth could somehow tether her to reality. Keanu observed quietly, aware that this night marked a turning point not only for her, but for him as well. She had finally spoken about the pain, the scar, and the burden of the choices that had brought her here. But now came the most challenging part, accepting genuine help. Mrs. Collins sighed, placing the cup on the table. Keanu straightened his posture. "Now, let me help," he said. She let out a soft, weary laugh. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Keanu met her gaze. "By taking you somewhere you can start anew." She shook her head. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" She opened her mouth to reply but hesitated. For the first time, she seemed uncertain about refusing. Keanu noticed and realized he was close to breaking the invisible barrier she had erected around herself. He took a deep breath before continuing. "I found you by chance tonight, but now that I have, I won't just walk away." She looked away. "I don't want to be your responsibility, Keanu." "It's not about responsibility," he leaned forward slightly. "It's about choice." She blinked, puzzled. "Choice?" "Yes, you chose to help so many students in the past. You chose to believe in me when I doubted myself. Now it's my turn to believe in you." She swallowed hard. The truth was, no one had spoken to her like this in a long time. "And what if I fail?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Keanu gave her a small, knowing smile. "And what if you don't?" Mrs. Collins fell silent. That was it. The question she had never allowed herself to ask. She had spent her life believing she was already lost. But now, for the first time in a long time, someone was asking, "What if you weren't?" Slowly, as if testing the words, she murmured, "What do you have in mind?" Keanu didn't hide his smile. "A support center for homeless women. They offer recovery programs, therapy, housing assistance, and job referrals." She frowned slightly. "And you think I belong there?" Keanu raised an eyebrow. "I think you deserve a second chance." Mrs. Collins remained silent for a long moment, the internal struggle visible. But then she slowly nodded. It was barely a movement, but Keanu saw it. "Okay," she said. Those words, so simple, meant far more than they seemed. They were the beginning of something new. Keanu drove through the still sleeping city, this time not on his motorcycle. He had managed to get a car so she could be more comfortable. She sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching the streets pass by through the window, lost in thought. By the time they arrived at the center, the sun was beginning to rise. It was a simple, unassuming building, but with a welcoming atmosphere. Women moved about, some carrying bags, others speaking in hushed voices. Keanu turned off the engine and looked at her. "Ready?" She let out a slow breath. "I don't know." "That's okay," he smiled. "We do this at your pace." She looked at the entrance, then back at Keanu, and finally, she opened the car door and stepped out. Mrs. Collins walked slowly toward the entrance, her fingers hovering over the door handle, hesitating. Keanu stood beside her. "One step at a time," he said. She closed her eyes for a moment, and then finally, she stepped inside. Keanu smiled. The transformation had begun. The support center carried the faint scent of coffee and freshly baked bread. The walls were lined with framed messages of encouragement, and the space felt warmer than Mrs. Collins had expected. But the discomfort was still there. She felt every glance that landed on her, every voice murmuring in the background. A part of her wanted to turn around and leave before it was too late. But then she looked to her side. Keanu was there. No rush, no pressure, just waiting. She took a deep breath and took the first step. The community theater was bustling that afternoon. Children ran across the stage, laughing, trying to memorize their lines for the play at the end of the month. Keanu walked among the young actors, helping a boy project his voice, but suddenly he stopped. In the distance, near the side door, he saw her, Mrs. Collins. Not the woman he had found that cold night. Now she was stronger, more alive. Her once unkempt hair was neatly tied in a simple bun, and her clothes were clean and well kept. She looked more herself. Keanu smiled. She caught his gaze and walked over. "I think you tricked me, Reeves," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? How so?" She crossed her arms, looking at the stage. "You told me it was just a support center. You didn't tell me it was also a place where I'd find myself again." He chuckled. "Some things you only discover along the way." Mrs. Collins sighed, shaking her head. "I never thought I'd work with theater again." Keanu smiled. "But it was always in you." She looked at him for a moment, saying nothing. Then a small smile appeared on her lips. She turned to the children on stage. "All right, everyone. I want to feel some real emotion in those lines." The young actors' voices grew louder, and the stage came to life once more. Keanu crossed his arms and watched. She was back. Maybe not completely. Maybe there would still be hard days. But for the first time in a long time, she was truly there. Life doesn't always give second chances, but sometimes all we need is someone who believes in us. If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, compassion, and resilience.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new story. We have a fascinating one for you every day.